He leaned across the table at dinner and whispered, "I'm going to marry your sister," as if I didn't already know, as if he hadn't wrecked everything 6 months ago, in the bed that was supposed to be ours. The whole table was bracing for a breakdown I had no intention of delivering, so I turned, gave him the same smile he'd given me the night he shattered my world, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Congratulations, and I'm with the head of the Mafia." And right as the laughter started curdling into pity, the restaurant door opened. Lorenzo Moretti walked through the room without rushing, looked only at me, and extended his hand. What I didn't know yet was that the lie had never been mine. It had always been his. Chapter 1. The Daughter Who Was Left. Over the Moretti Grand had that particular scent of polished mahogany and generational wealth that clung to the air like a quiet statement. I cut across the lobby with my tablet clutched to my chest, weaving around a cluster of German-speaking executives who'd turned the reception area into their personal boardroom. The event hall sat at the far end of the east wing. Past a service entrance I could find blindfolded, and I had less than an hour to inspect the panoramic window setup facing Elliott Bay. The kind of client who drops a small fortune on a view is exactly the kind of client who'll lose their mind over a curtain that's slightly off-center. I shouldered the door open and stepped inside, already scanning the chair arrangement on the right, mentally tallying what was missing from the semicircle, when my brain snagged on something unexpected. Lorenzo Moretti stood at the glass wall with his hands buried in the pockets of a charcoal suit, staring out at Puget Sound the way someone studies a chessboard mid-game. Patient, deliberate, unhurried. The dying afternoon light caught the sharp edges of his jaw, his broad shoulders, the rigid stillness of a man whose presence filled a room without effort or invitation. A stockier man stood next to him, murmuring something low, but Lorenzo gave no sign that any of it was reaching him. This was the third time our paths had crossed in a matter of weeks. The first was up on the mezzanine during a charity event I was running for the hotel. He appeared, lingered for maybe 20 minutes, exchanged a few words with a man in round glasses, and vanished. I never saw the man in glasses again. The second time was at the ground floor restaurant entrance. I was rushing out for lunch, my laptop bag slung over one shoulder in a way no one would call graceful. He held the door without a word. I muttered a thank you without lifting my eyes, because I was running late and hungry, and didn't have the bandwidth for attractive strangers with good manners. But this time, in the vast emptiness of that hall, with the amber glow off the bay turning everything golden, he turned. He looked at me, and I looked back. Miss Hayes, low, unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't fight for space in a room because it already owned every corner of it. What froze me in place wasn't the formality or the way my surname seemed to hover between us for a beat too long. It was that he knew it at all. No one had introduced us. Not once in 3 encounters had someone thought to say, "This is Scarlett, she handles events here," or offered any of the usual courtesies that bridge the gap between a recurring guest and a member of staff. Yet he spoke my name as casually as if he were noting the time, like it was simply a fact he'd always had. "Mr. Moretti," I said, because professionalism was the only reflex that fired fast enough to beat the silence. His gaze lingered on me 1 second past comfortable, and something in it triggered an instinct I couldn't quite name. Not fear, but a deeper awareness. The kind that tells you certain doors, once opened, don't close on your terms. The man beside him observed us without a word, hands laced behind his back, his face carefully blank. Lorenzo didn't smile. I got the impression he never did. Instead, he gave a slight tilt of his head, something between acknowledgement and appraisal, and turned back to the water as though I'd already left. I walked to the semicircle, checked every chair, noted the 2 that were missing, and the curtain on the left that needed straightening. My hands didn't shake. My breathing stayed even. I didn't glance back, not because the urge wasn't there, but because I was almost certain he was still watching, and confirming that felt like conceding something I wasn't ready to give up. The hallway air hit me like ice water the moment I stepped through the service door, and the breath I'd been holding without realizing it rushed out of me in one long exhale. Lorenzo Moretti belonged to a world I only ever glimpsed from the margins, the world of guests who reserved entire hotel floors and settled bills in cash, of tailored suits and black cars that arrived at the entrance with a driver and no license plate visible. I had no clear picture of what he did for a living, and the part of me that had long ago learned to read what people left unsaid suspected it was safer to keep it that way. The Uber left me at my building in Fremont, right as the last daylight was sinking behind the trees. 3 floors, no elevator, a facade that had once been mint green and had since faded into something closer to mold. My apartment occupied the ground level, a small balcony out front, where 2 pots of lavender somehow kept surviving, despite every reason not to. I tossed my bag onto the couch, kicked off my shoes, and drifted into the kitchen to assemble something that could generously be classified as dinner. I was halfway through slicing a tomato when the phone buzzed, and the name on the screen made my grip tighten around the knife. Meredith Hayes. My mother. I could ignore it. Let it ring out, then send a vague text. Shower, headache, early night. Anything to buy myself a few more hours of peace. But I knew how this worked. She'd call back in 5 minutes, then 10, then 20. The phone would keep vibrating on the counter like a countdown I couldn't outrun. I answered, "Scarlett, I need to discuss Thursday." She launched in before I could get a syllable out, as if the conversation had been running in her head long before she dialed. "Dinner at Bellini's, 8 o'clock. Your sister wants the family there. Ethan proposed over the weekend, the ring is already on her finger. And now they want to make it official. An engagement dinner. Everyone together." Every word landed precise and polished. No hesitation. No room for negotiation. That was Meredith Hayes. She orchestrated indignities with the same meticulous care she brought to holiday table arrangements. Every element placed with intention. Every role pre-assigned, and God help anyone who tried to improvise. "Mom," I said, and was surprised by how steady my voice sounded, because internally my stomach was staging a revolt the half-sliced tomato did not deserve to witness. "Ethan is my ex-fiancé, Chloe is my sister, and you want me to sit at a table and toast their engagement, with wine and dessert. I want you to show up for an important family occasion. That's not the same thing." It was exactly the same thing. But my mother had a near supernatural talent for dressing cruelty in language so measured, so outwardly reasonable, that anyone listening from the outside would wonder what I was complaining about. A talent like that could be called a gift or a blade. I'd spent years trying to tell the difference, and never managed. "If you skip it," she pressed, her tone straddling the line between concern and warning, "people will notice. And I've already fielded enough comments since you and Ethan ended things. I don't need more. People, comments, appearances. It always circled back to that, to what the neighbors saw, to the narrative making rounds at Laurelhurst dinner parties and charity brunches, to the polished illusion of a family that functioned beautifully from the outside and, from the inside, ran about as well as a clock stripped of its hands. "I'll think about it," I said, because refusing my mother was like leaning into a concrete wall, theoretically doable, physically draining, and ultimately pointless, because the wall always pushed back harder. "Think quickly. The table's already booked." The line went dead. No goodbye. Meredith Hayes didn't waste syllables once her point had been made. I stood in the kitchen staring at the phone in one hand and the abandoned tomato on the cutting board, cycling through every response I'd swallowed, every sharp truth I'd bitten back, because speaking it would have cost more than I could afford. The reality was clean and cutting. I was the leftover daughter. I'd always been. Chloe was the younger one, the effortlessly charming one, the one who never had to work for a proud look from our parents. I was the other, the eldest, the self-sufficient one, the one who'd carved out an entire career on her own and still couldn't occupy the space my sister claimed just by walking into a room. And now Chloe had Ethan, the man who'd shared my bed, who'd made promises I was naive enough to trust, and who I'd found with my sister in a way that still sent bile rising in my throat whenever the memory surfaced uninvited, and it surfaced often, with a vicious regularity, almost always in the dark, almost always right when sleep was finally within reach. No one knew that part. No one knew what I'd actually seen. I'd constructed a sanitized version. Things ran their course. We parted ways, no bitterness, and repeated it until the words felt almost true. Almost. Because the real story still lived underneath all that composure, like a bone that healed crooked and only aches when the weather turns. I set the phone by the sink, left the tomato where it was, and moved to the living room. I lay on the couch in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and let myself think about all of it. Bellini's, the reserved table, Chloe's radiant smile, my mother's look of satisfaction, Ethan's hand, and the ring that should have been on my finger. I wasn't going. Absolutely not. I was going. And knowing that I was going, knowing full well that every minute at that table would feel like a careful velvet-gloved demolition, was the worst part of all. Because it meant that even after everything, my mother's voice still drowned out mine. The ceiling offered nothing. I had nothing either. Chapter 2. 20 Minutes of Revenge. I woke up with a parched mouth and the unmistakable awareness that whatever I'd done overnight didn't qualify as sleep, just a prolonged act of lying still with my eyes shut while my body faked recovery. The light filtering through my bedroom window was the flat, colorless gray that Seattle reserves for days when it wants you to know it's not on your side. I stayed in bed longer than I should have, staring up at nothing, because the ceiling was the one thing in my life that wasn't asking me for something. Dinner was tomorrow. That thought followed me like a shadow, while I stood at the bathroom mirror, while I filled the kettle, while I picked up my phone and found 3 messages from Chloe in the family group chat, a photo of the restaurant, a heart, and a question. Scar, did you confirm with Mom? I didn't reply. I flipped the phone face down on the counter as though hiding the screen could erase the words. It couldn't. The morning dissolved into lukewarm coffee and a low-grade dread that had settled behind my ribs like something physical. I tried to get work done from the apartment, a budget review for a corporate cocktail the Moretti Grand was hosting the following week, but the numbers refused to hold still. They swam and rearranged themselves on the screen while my mind drifted to Bellini's, to the table, to the chair where I'd be placed with a clear sightline to Chloe, flashing that ring, the whole family raising their glasses, my sister performing her flawless impression of someone who hadn't detonated my life. I shut the laptop, went to the living room, found a bottle of white wine in the fridge from a night I couldn't place, and poured a glass I emptied too quickly for a Wednesday afternoon. Then I poured a second, because the first hadn't fixed anything, and the second at least pretended to try. Halfway through that second glass, sitting cross-legged on the couch with the daylight dying behind the curtain, the idea arrived. It didn't arrive as a plan. It arrived as a picture. Me, walking into Bellini's with someone beside me. Not a friend, not a colleague, not some distant relative recruited at the last minute to occupy the empty chair. Someone who would make every fork at that table freeze midair. Someone who would make Ethan Prescott swallow his proposal along with the bread. Someone who would strip my mother of the one thing she'd never once lost, control of the story. And the face in that picture, ridiculous, reckless, completely unhinged, was Lorenzo Moretti's. I put the glass on the floor before I could spill it, because the couch had suffered enough. Lorenzo Moretti. A man I'd crossed paths with exactly 3 times, who somehow already knew my name, who watched me with the quiet precision of someone running calculations I wasn't cleared to see. A man whose profession I couldn't pin down, but whose world. I understood this with the kind of intelligence you develop when you've spent years listening to what people don't say, was the kind that left no paper trail. It was insane. It was the sort of thing a woman does after 2 glasses of wine on a hollow stomach when she's too afraid to feel afraid. It was everything I would never do, which was exactly why I stood up. I got dressed with the brisk efficiency of someone who refuses to let reason catch up. A fitted black dress with long sleeves, serious enough to mean business, understated enough not to send the wrong message. Shoes that would announce my arrival the second I crossed a marble floor. I called an Uber before the sensible part of my brain could mount a defense. In the back seat, watching Seattle scroll past the window while the driver kept a merciful silence, I rehearsed what I'd say. I tried 3 versions, discarded all of them. There was no graceful way to ask a near stranger to play my boyfriend at a family dinner. No script existed for this kind of lunacy, and every sentence I assembled fell apart before it reached its point. The Moretti Grand appeared ahead, its facade glowing against the wet pavement, and my stomach clenched in a way that had nothing to do with the wine. I crossed the lobby with my chin lifted and the stride of someone who belonged there, which I did, during working hours at least. The reception desk was a sweep of dark marble staffed by 2 employees I knew by name, and when the taller one spotted me arriving after hours, his face flickered between surprise and a well-trained attempt to hide it. "I need to go up," I said, gesturing vaguely toward the ceiling in what was meant to convey top floor, but probably looked more like I was pointing at heaven. "Mr. Moretti's office. He's not receiving visitors," the receptionist replied, with the practiced diplomacy of someone who says no dozens of times a day and needs each refusal to land like a gentle suggestion rather than a locked door. "I work here," I said, and before he could follow up, I was already heading toward the private elevator at the end of the east corridor, tucked behind the same wood-paneled wall I passed daily without ever having used it. The elevator had 1 button. When I pressed it, the panel requested a code. I didn't have a code. What I had was 2 glasses of wine, an impulsive decision, and a streak of stubbornness inherited directly from the woman who'd called me the night before to invite me to my own emotional execution. I stood there for 3 seconds, glaring at the keypad as though sheer willpower might persuade it, when the door slid open from the inside. The man who stepped out was shorter than Lorenzo, and twice as wide, with shoulders that looked built for breaking through walls, and a face that wore the permanent expression of someone long past the point of being surprised by anything. He scanned me, not with interest, but with the quick, clinical assessment of a person whose job description revolved around measuring threats, then leaned a shoulder against the doorframe, as if time were something he had in unlimited supply. "Women who show up unannounced usually bring a gun or a court order," he said, his voice dry enough to crack glass. "Which one is it?" "A favor," I answered, because honesty was the only currency I had left. He studied me one more second, then stepped aside and held the door. Tobias Carrozza, I'd learn his name later, was the kind of man who made decisions without narration. The elevator climbed in silence. When the doors parted on the top floor, a wide corridor stretched ahead, bathed in the soft glow of indirect lighting that made everything feel slightly unreal. It ended at a set of double doors in dark wood, one of them already ajar. Tobias walked ahead, nudged the door open with 2 fingers, and took up position against the outside wall, his station clearly, and one he'd occupied many times before. Lorenzo Moretti's office was everything I should have predicted, and nothing I was prepared for. The far wall was floor-to-ceiling glass, and beyond it, Puget Sound sprawled dark and endless, fairy lights tracing slow arcs across the water. The desk was large and nearly bare, a brass lamp, 2 crystal tumblers that served as either decoration or an unspoken invitation. No photographs, no personal touches. Nothing to suggest a human being spent hours of his life in this room, only the austere precision of a space that existed on its owner's terms. And the owner was already facing me, standing by the window without his jacket, shirt sleeves pushed up past his forearms, his gaze fixed on me before I'd even crossed the threshold. "Miss Hayes," he said, and my name in his voice carried the same weight it had the first time, inevitable, as though no other words had been available to him. "I need a favor." It came out raw, unpolished, stripped of every diplomatic wrapper I'd meant to dress it in. "I know this makes no sense. I know I have no business being here, but I need 20 minutes of your evening tomorrow, and after that I'll leave and never step into this elevator again." He didn't move. No frown, no crossed arms, none of the reflexive gestures people reach for when they hear something absurd. He stayed exactly where he was, hands in his pockets, wrapped in that dense, weighted stillness I was starting to realize was the most dangerous thing about him. 20 minutes, he said, not a question, a measurement, as though he were turning the number over in his mind, testing its shape before deciding what to do with it. "At a restaurant, tomorrow night, Bellini's, Capitol Hill." I spoke fast, because if I paused to breathe, the nerve would abandon me. "My family will be there. My ex-fiancé will be there. He got engaged to my sister, and my mother organized a celebration dinner right in front of me. I can't walk in there alone." The silence that followed had weight. It pressed against my eardrums, thick and almost tangible. Lorenzo watched me with an attention I couldn't categorize. Not curiosity, not sympathy. Something more precise, more surgical, as though he were disassembling each word I'd spoken and rearranging the pieces into a pattern that served him better. Then he moved, 2 unhurried steps toward me, with the deliberate economy of a man who never rushes because nothing starts without his permission. He stopped close enough that I caught his cologne, something rich and woody that blended with the clean air of the office, and close enough that pretending my breathing hadn't shifted was no longer an option. "Who's the ex?" His voice dropped low, almost private, as if the question mattered more than the casual tone was willing to admit. "Ethan Prescott." Something flickered behind his eyes, brief, so brief that a blink would have buried it. It wasn't surprise. It was recognition. The kind that surfaces when a name you've heard before reappears in a context that rearranges its meaning. But nothing else moved. His posture held, his expression stayed locked, and the composure with which he absorbed those 2 syllables was so total that I nearly convinced myself I'd invented the reaction. "Nearly. Tomorrow at 9, he said. No question. No negotiation. A statement. Clean, definitive, leaving no opening for gratitude or follow-up questions. He turned back to the window, and I understood, with the clarity of an unspoken instruction, that I was dismissed. I left his office with my pulse hammering so loud, I was certain Tobias could hear it from the corridor. He said nothing as I passed, just peeled himself off the wall and walked me to the elevator with the easy indifference of someone who regularly escorts people out of places they were never meant to enter. In the Uber heading back to Fremont, with the city streaming past the glass and the streetlights painting the window in rhythmic stripes, I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I'd walked into the office of the most imposing man I'd ever encountered, made a request that defied all logic, and walked out with a yes that didn't sound like a favor. It sounded like a decision he'd been waiting to make. And then there was the name, Ethan Prescott. The way Lorenzo reacted, or rather, the way he contained the reaction, told me it meant something to him. Something I wasn't privy to, something he had no intention of sharing. But I was too drained to probe, and too relieved to challenge it. And in that moment, the only thing that mattered was uncomplicated. I wouldn't be alone tomorrow. I tipped my head against the seat and closed my eyes, and behind my eyelids I saw him, standing at the window with the sound at his back, watching me the way someone watches a chess piece that just moved itself to a square no one anticipated. I left the hotel convinced I'd won something. Lorenzo Moretti, standing at that same window with the whole city stretched beneath him, was already losing. Chapter 3. And I'm with the head of the Mafia. The moss green dress was a clearance rack impulse I'd never had the nerve to wear, the kind of color that demands something from you before you even leave the house. It hugged where it should, and gave room where it needed to, and when I checked my reflection in the bedroom mirror before walking out, the woman staring back looked far more composed than the one living inside her. My hair was swept into a side braid Dell had walked me through one night over wine, and a phone propped against a stack of books, and my earrings were small, deliberate, the kind of detail only someone watching closely would catch, and I didn't want anyone watching me closely. I wanted to be invisible right up until the moment I chose not to be. The phone buzzed while I was fastening my shoe strap, and Dell's name on the screen felt like a lifeline I hadn't realized I was reaching for. Tell me you're not getting dressed for what I think you're getting dressed for. Delaney Osie's voice arrived without warning or punctuation, carrying the same relentless energy that made her flower shop in Fremont the loudest and warmest corner of the neighborhood at once. Dell was my closest friend since college, the kind of person who told the truth especially when the truth stung, and who could make any catastrophe survivable just by the way she talked about it. I'm getting ready, I confirmed, yanking the buckle tighter than necessary, to attend the engagement dinner for your ex and your sister, with your mother running the show. Scarlett Hayes, I am begging you. I have a plan, I said, and the words came out steadier than they had any right to, given that 24 hours earlier, my plan had been sobbing into a glass of cheap white wine on the couch. I have a plan is the sentence people say right before they end up on the evening news. What plan? I'm bringing someone. Dell went quiet for 2 full seconds, which, for her, was the equivalent of a long meditative silence. Who? Someone who's going to make Ethan choke on his own ring. Scarlett. Who? I'll tell you after, I said, because speaking Lorenzo Moretti's name to my best friend would have sent Dell marching across Fremont in her flip-flops to physically block my door, and I could not be blocked. Not tonight. I ended the call before she could object, grabbed my bag, and headed downstairs to where the Uber was already idling at the curb, the dashboard glow illuminating a driver who couldn't have cared less about my personal crisis. I gave the address for Bellini's and leaned back, and the city streamed past in wet smears of light, while I breathed slowly and told myself it was just a dinner, just one evening, that in a few hours it would all be behind me. The lie was useful. Lies usually are when the truth is too much to carry. Bellini's occupied a Capitol Hill corner that seemed borrowed from another era. Dark brick, gold script above the entrance, a wooden door with frosted glass that concealed the interior as if the restaurant refused to reveal itself to anyone who hadn't earned entry. It was exactly the kind of place my mother selected with clinical precision. Classic Italian, dim lighting, linen on every table, waiters who remembered your name and never raised their voices. A flawless stage for whatever performance she had choreographed. I stepped inside, and the air greeted me with the scent of fresh pasta, olive oil, and melting candle wax. The main room unfolded before me with its communal tables and that warm, golden light that made everyone look better than they deserved. A kindness I was going to need tonight. The reserved table sat in the back right corner, separated from the others not by distance but by arrangement, the spacing of the chairs, the angle of the setting, everything signaling that this table was different. These people were different, and everyone seated there knew it. My mother was already in position. Meredith Hayes wore a pearl-toned dress and a look of satisfaction expertly calibrated to pass for warmth when it was, in fact, triumph. Beside her, my father, Richard Hayes, a man who occupied space with roughly the same presence as a vacant chair, turned his napkin over in his hands without meeting anyone's eyes. And at the far end of the table, as if the universe had staged the scene for maximum devastation, sat Chloe and Ethan. Chloe was beautiful the way a clear morning is beautiful, naturally, inevitably, without apparent effort. At 23, my younger sister had the kind of face that drew smiles out of strangers before they realized they were smiling, and tonight she was luminous in a pale blue dress, wearing a grin that wavered between joy and something I couldn't name in the moment, but that, if I'd been less proud, I might have called unease. She spotted me first and waved, a small gesture carrying a hesitation my mother didn't register, but that I catalogued like a piece of evidence. Ethan Prescott rose when I approached, because Ethan Prescott always rose, not from manners, but from the need to ensure every room registered his existence while standing. Heir to a Bellevue family that had made its fortune in luxury real estate, Ethan had the polished smile of a man who'd learned to appear charming long before he'd learned to be anything at all. The light eyes, the flawless hair, the suit he inhabited as though he'd been born wearing it, all of it was a performance so thoroughly rehearsed that during the time we were together, I'd confused competence with character. "Scarlett," he said, and my name in his mouth sounded like a song I once loved played in the wrong key. "I'm glad you came, really." The lie was so polished it barely left a trace. "Me too," I replied, and lowered myself into the chair wedged between my mother and an empty seat that, judging by the silverware arrangement, was intended to remain empty. The leftover daughter seated next to the leftover place. The symmetry was almost elegant, if you could build elegance from domestic cruelty. Dinner unfolded with the efficiency of a script everyone had memorized but me. My mother steered the conversation with the natural authority of a stage director, distributing questions like blocking cues, laughing at calculated intervals, touching Chloe's arm with an ease she'd never extended to me and that I'd long since stopped expecting. Ethan was talking about a renovation at the Escala apartment, Unit 1204, the same apartment where I'd found them together, the same number that still made my stomach contract as though the digits carried their own gravity. And Chloe listened with a smile that could have been devotion or compliance, and I no longer knew the difference. My mother slid a glass of wine toward me, with the casualness of someone pouring water, and I drank because I needed to do something with my hands that wasn't gripping the tablecloth. "The ring is gorgeous," my mother declared, studying Chloe's hand with a satisfaction she didn't bother disguising. The ring was already in place, a delicate white gold band, with a center stone that caught the candlelight with the stubborn insistence expensive gems have. I let my gaze rest on it a beat too long, and noticed an inscription on the inner band, too small to read from where I sat, but visible enough to confirm it was there. Chloe extended her hand with a laugh that wasn't proud. It was self-conscious, brief, fading quickly, as though she wasn't sure she had permission to feel what she was feeling. My mother didn't notice. My mother never noticed the things that actually mattered. Dinner continued. Ethan launched into a story about a weekend in Napa Valley with the confidence of a man accustomed to captive audiences, and with every passing minute I felt the pressure building inside me like water filling a glass. Gradual, constant, invisible to anyone watching from outside, but dangerously close to spilling over. It spilled at dessert. Ethan leaned toward me while my mother was discussing flower arrangements with Chloe for the wedding, and the motion was casual enough that no one else at the table caught it. He brought his mouth close to my ear, his breath brushing my skin with a familiarity that turned my stomach, and he said in a voice pitched for me alone, "I'm going to marry your sister." It wasn't information. It was a display. Ethan Prescott didn't whisper to inform. He whispered to claim ground, to remind you who held the upper hand, to twist the blade with the precision of a surgeon who knew exactly where the nerve endings were. And packed inside that sentence was everything he'd never said aloud, that I wasn't enough, that Chloe was the better choice, that he could do this right in front of me because I would never fight back. I should have stayed silent. I should have smiled, taken another sip, swallowed the humiliation with the tiramisu, and driven home to cry in my dark apartment, the way I did every time reality put me back in my assigned place. That was the expectation. That was what the old Scarlett would have done. But the old Scarlett hadn't walked into Lorenzo Moretti's office the night before. I straightened my spine, lifted my wine glass with a hand that did not tremble, and that alone was already a victory, and answered loud enough for the entire table to hear. "That's great. And I'm with the head of the Mafia." The table laughed. My mother produced that polite, reflexive laugh people deploy when they've missed the joke, but refused to be the last to react. Chloe stared at me with wide eyes. Ethan broke into a smile that was equal parts condescension and certainty, because in his mind, the ex was simply cracking wise to survive the evening. Then the door of Bellini's opened. Lorenzo Moretti entered the restaurant as though the entire space had been designed around his arrival. He didn't scan the room. didn't search for the table, didn't hesitate. He crossed the full length of the dining room in a stride that was unhurried and unstoppable at the same time, the charcoal suit flawless under the warm light, and every person he passed fell silent for half a second, not because they knew who he was, but because the body recognizes authority before the mind catches up. He looked only at me, and in that look was something I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't performance, it wasn't obligation, it wasn't the favor being executed on schedule. It was something warmer, more authentic, more dangerous than anything I'd imagined when I stood in his office the night before. He stopped beside my chair and extended his hand. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His hand was there, open, steady, waiting, and the gesture was at once an invitation and a verdict. I placed my hand in his, and Lorenzo's fingers closed around mine with a pressure that was controlled and possessive in equal measure, as if he were saying without a single word that from this point forward I was under his care. I rose from the chair. The entire table had gone still. My mother's wineglass hung suspended between the table and her lips. Chloe was staring at Lorenzo with an expression somewhere between shock and what might have been fear. My father, for the first time all evening, had stopped fidgeting with his napkin. And Ethan Prescott, the Bellevue heir, the man who whispered to wound and smiled to conceal it, looked at Lorenzo with the face of someone who has just understood he's sitting at the wrong table. The smug grin had vanished, replaced by a swift, instinctive recognition I hadn't expected. Ethan knew Lorenzo, or knew the reputation, or knew the kind of man standing in front of him. Whatever the source, it was enough to drain the color from his face in the span of 2 heartbeats. Lorenzo said nothing to the table. No greeting, no introduction, none of the courtesies the moment would have demanded from anyone else. He simply looked down at Ethan, once, briefly, with measured precision. The look carried no explicit threat, but it held the weight of a silent promise I couldn't decode, and that Ethan clearly could. Then Lorenzo turned his back on the table and walked toward the door, and I went with him, because his hand still held mine, and because in that instant there was no place in the world I wanted to be, except beside the man who had just turned the worst dinner of my life into the finest exit I'd ever made. The sidewalk outside Bellini's was slick with the fine mist drifting over Capitol Hill, and a black SUV waited at the curb with the engine running and tinted windows catching the gold of the restaurant's sign. Lorenzo opened the door for me without releasing my hand, and when I slid into the back seat and he settled beside me, the interior wrapped around us in a silence that smelled of leather and something woody I was already starting to associate with him and no one else. I stepped out through that door feeling the cool night air on my face and his hand still around mine, and I believed I understood everything, that the look he'd aimed at Ethan had been for my benefit, that his entrance had been the favor delivered, that the quiet inside the car was the stillness after the performance. But Lorenzo's look at Ethan hadn't been for my sake. I just didn't know that yet. Chapter 4. After the door at Bellini's, the SUV glided through Capitol Hill without a word spoken, and I was bracing for the moment Lorenzo would end the evening. A polite goodnight, the driver turning north toward Fremont, and me walking into my apartment alone to sit with the wreckage of what I'd just done. The script was simple. Thank you, good night, we never speak of this again. Quick and clean, like pulling off a bandage in one motion. But the car didn't turn toward Fremont. I noticed when we crossed the bridge over the canal, and the city lights trembled on the dark water below. My apartment was to the right, north. The driver, Tobias, the same man who'd opened the elevator for me the night before, kept straight, heading west, skirting downtown with the practiced ease of a route driven daily. This isn't the way to my place, I said, and my voice held steadier than it should have, given that my pulse was still catching up from the restaurant. Lorenzo sat beside me with the composure of a man in a boardroom, reclined, unhurried, entirely in command. He didn't look at me when he spoke, and his words came out low and deliberate, carrying the weight of something already decided before I'd thought to ask. Not everyone at that restaurant heard your line as a joke. The sentence settled between us, and I felt its meaning peel open inside my head. Slowly, one layer after another, each layer reshaping what I'd done. I had said, I'm with the head of the Mafia, loud enough for a table of 6 to hear, in a packed restaurant, in Capitol Hill. I'd meant it as a punchline. My mother took it as a punchline. Chloe took it as a punchline. Ethan took it as a punchline. Right up until Lorenzo walked through the door and made it real. But not everyone heard a punchline, and the ones who didn't were exactly the people I never wanted knowing my name. Where are we going? I asked, because the question I actually needed to ask, what are you telling me, was too large for the inside of that car. Queen Anne. Lorenzo said. 2 words, a neighborhood, nothing more. The rest of the ride passed in silence. I watched the city shift through the window as we climbed, the commercial blocks of downtown giving way to older residential streets, the lights thinning, the traffic fading until the SUV was the only vehicle on the road. Tobias drove without haste, with the certainty of someone who knew every curve by memory, and not once did he glance at Lorenzo in the rearview mirror. He didn't need to. The destination had been settled long before we arrived. The building in Queen Anne had no name on its facade. A low-rise with a discreet entrance and a lobby that functioned more as a checkpoint than a welcome. No decor, no signage, nothing to suggest anyone lived there. Tobias parked at the side entrance, stepped out first, held the door for Lorenzo, and then for me, and the 3 of us passed through a door that opened with a code Tobias entered before I could catch the numbers. The private elevator was soundless and fast, and when the doors parted on the top floor, I stepped into Lorenzo Moretti's penthouse and understood, with the kind of clarity that only arrives when exhaustion has stripped away every defense, that this man lived exactly as I would have guessed, and nothing like I was prepared for. The living room was enormous, with soaring ceilings and an entire wall of glass opening onto Lake Union, and beyond it, the illuminated outline of the Space Needle against the dark Seattle sky. The space was clean in a way that went past orderly. It was the intentional removal of anything personal. No photographs, no scattered books, none of the small traces of daily life that people accumulate without thinking. The furniture was dark and austere, chosen with the same surgical precision as the hotel office, and the only light came from a standing lamp in the corner that washed everything in amber, softening the hard edges of the room without quite warming it. Lorenzo moved through the space without switching on another light, and I followed because there was nothing else to do, literally or otherwise. He stopped at a door at the end of a narrow hallway, opened it with a gesture that carried no ceremony, and stepped aside so I could see. A bedroom, a wide bed dressed in white linen, a dresser, an armchair positioned by the window, with a view of the far side of Lake Union, and a half-open door revealing a bathroom with dark tile. The room was as impersonal as everything else in the apartment, but it was clean, and it was quiet, and quiet was the only thing I needed. "You're staying here tonight," he said, and his voice carried no trace of a request or a suggestion. It was a fact, delivered the way someone states an address or reads a forecast. The bathroom has what you need. Anything it doesn't, Tobias will take care of. He drew a phone from the inner pocket of his jacket, black, slim, no case, no visible branding, and set it on the dresser beside the door. "Use this one. Yours can wait until morning." I looked at the phone, then at him. A flood of questions jammed in my throat like cars at a bottleneck, all of them trying to get through at once, none of them clearing the intersection. But the one that escaped was the simplest and the most impossible to answer. Why? Lorenzo held my gaze for a second that stretched longer than it should have, and somewhere behind the composure I saw something shift. Quick, contained, immediately locked down. He didn't answer. He wasn't going to. I was beginning to understand that Lorenzo Moretti's silence wasn't the absence of an answer. It was the answer, and I needed to learn how to read it. "Rest," was all he said, and he left the room, pulling the door shut behind him with the same quietness he brought to everything. No sound, no rush, no space for argument. I stood in the center of that room for a stretch of time I couldn't measure, shoes still on, bag still hanging from my shoulder, staring at the bed and the window and the unfamiliar phone on the dresser, trying to assemble the pieces of an evening that had begun with a moss-green dress and ended on the top floor of a nameless building in Queen Anne. The exhaustion arrived all at once, a wave that had been waiting for the exact moment I stopped moving to pull me under. I kicked off my shoes, dropped the bag onto the armchair, and collapsed onto the bed without changing, without washing my face, without doing any of the things a functioning person does before sleep. The sheets smelled of lavender and something neutral I couldn't place, and the silence of the penthouse was different from the silence of my apartment, thicker, more sealed, as though the world outside had been switched off. I closed my eyes and thought about Lorenzo standing in the doorway, about the why he'd left unanswered, about what he'd said in the car. "Not everyone heard your line as a joke," and about the gravity those words carried. I gave in out of exhaustion. Not trust, not choice, not any of the reasons a rational person would offer for sleeping in the home of a man she barely knew. I gave in because my body had nothing left, and because, for a reason I still couldn't explain, this was the first place in days where I felt safe. Sleep pulled me under before I could decide whether that was a comfort or a warning. Morning came with gray light seeping through the guest room window, and the scent of coffee drifting from somewhere deeper in the apartment. I opened my eyes slowly, disoriented for a beat, before the memory assembled itself. The restaurant, the line, Lorenzo, the car, the bedroom, and when it arrived in full, it brought a faint nausea that might have been hunger, or might have been my body bracing for whatever came next. I got up, went to the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, and dried it with a towel unreasonably soft. The woman in the mirror was wearing a wrinkled moss-green dress, smudged makeup under her eyes, and a braid that had surrendered overnight into stray strands pointing in all directions. I looked like someone who'd survived something, which, on reflection, was accurate. I followed the smell of coffee down the hallway and into the kitchen, which opened onto the living room across a dark marble counter that caught the gray daylight. Lorenzo was there with his back to me, filling 2 mugs with the unhurried ease of a daily ritual. He wore a button-down shirt with the sleeves pushed to his forearms, no jacket, none of the suit's armor, and the difference was subtle but real. He seemed 1 shade less impenetrable than the night before, as though the privacy of his own home permitted a sliver of openness the office and the restaurant didn't. He heard me before I spoke, my bare feet on the wood floor probably, and placed a mug on the counter beside me without turning around. "Black or with milk?" "Black," I said, and climbed onto the stool at the counter, wrapping both hands around the mug as if I needed something to anchor me. The coffee was strong and good. I drank the first sip in silence, while Lorenzo leaned against the opposite side of the counter with his own mug and an expression I couldn't classify. Not discomfort, not impatience, something closer to a quiet evaluation, as though he were waiting for me to arrive at a conclusion on my own. Before any conclusion could form, the phone he'd given me the night before rang on the counter. My mother's number filled the screen, which meant either someone had passed along the new number, or Meredith Hayes had methods of tracking people down that would surprise no one who knew her. I answered, because not answering only postponed the inevitable, and postponing the inevitable was a strategy I'd tested many times and that had never once worked. "Scarlett Hayes, do you have any idea what you've done?" My mother's voice hit like an alarm. No preamble, no good morning, none of the courtesies she demanded from everyone else but discarded whenever the script went off the rails she'd laid. "The entire city is talking. The group chats are a nightmare. Eleanor Chambers called me at 7 this morning to ask whether my daughter is involved with criminals." 7 in the morning, Scarlett? "Mom." Lorenzo set his mug on the counter without a sound and stepped toward the living room, offering me space I hadn't requested but that he'd known I needed. "Your father didn't sleep," she pressed on, and there was something in her voice I hadn't expected. It wasn't just anger, and it wasn't just social mortification. It was something deeper, more urgent, bordering on desperation. "He's furious. Furious in a way I've never seen. And I've seen your father furious more times than I can count. He wants to speak with you. He wants to know who this man is." My father's fury caught me off guard. Richard Hayes was a man who sought out the quietest corner of every room, who spoke little and offered opinions even less, who had operated for my entire life as a passive presence, physically there, but never actively engaged. He didn't raise his voice, didn't push, didn't intervene. And now he was furious. Furious in a way my mother had never witnessed. The disproportionality was odd. So odd that I registered it without being able to explain it, and tucked it away as a piece of a puzzle that didn't yet have a shape. "Tell Dad I'm fine," I said, and my voice came out calmer than I felt, because Lorenzo was 2 meters away drinking coffee, and I refused to unravel in front of him. "You're fine? You walked out of a restaurant with a stranger in front of your entire family, and 'I'm fine' is your answer." "He's not a stranger," I said, and the sentence sounded more true than it had any right to, given that Lorenzo Moretti was still, technically, a man I barely knew who had for some reason offered me a guest room and black coffee on a Friday morning. Through the terrace door, the mist over Lake Union was starting to thin under the pale light, and the coffee in my mug had already gone cold. My mother talked for several more minutes, about reputation, about fallout, about the embarrassment Ethan and Chloe had endured, about how the proposal had been ruined because the older sister decided to stage a scene. I listened to all of it with the mug in my hand and my gaze fixed on the dark surface of the coffee, and when she finally hung up, without a goodbye, as always, I set the phone on the counter and felt 2 seconds of pure, scalding, shameful revenge flare in my chest before it burned itself out, because the truth landed right behind it. The charade wasn't over. I'd thought it was 20 minutes. In, out, finished. But the line I'd dropped at the restaurant was already making its way through the city. My father was furious in a way that made no sense. and I was drinking coffee in the penthouse of a man whose life I didn't understand and whose motives I couldn't read. I wasn't in control. Maybe I never had been. At that moment, my personal phone, buried in my bag since the night before, rang from the armchair in the guest room. The sound was muffled by the fabric, but I recognized the insistent vibration that meant a call, not a text. I went back to the bedroom, dug through the bag, and saw Dell's name on the screen. I answered. For the first 20 seconds, I heard no words. I heard a sequence of sounds that included my name repeated 3 times in escalating tones of outrage, the word Mafia pronounced in 4 distinct inflections, and what sounded like something toppling in the background, probably a vase from the shop, knowing Dell. When she finally stopped for air, the question came in a voice stranded somewhere between panic and grudging admiration. Scarlet Hayes, are you where I think you are? Dell, I need you to breathe. I am breathing. I'm breathing and reading at the same time, because Jennifer Liu just sent me a photo of you leaving Bellini's holding hands with a man who, according to the neighborhood group chat, is Lorenzo Moretti. Lorenzo Moretti, Scarlet. The man the City magazine put on the list of people you don't want problems with. That Lorenzo Moretti. Dell, are you at his place, right now, at this very moment? You are in the home of the man who controls half the port of Seattle and who, according to Vanessa Park, who is an attorney and actually knows about these things, has never been seen in public with any woman in recorded history. I'll explain everything when I see you, I said, and glanced toward the hallway where Lorenzo wasn't standing, but where his presence seemed to fill the space even in his absence. You are explaining right now, because I'm already putting together a sympathy bouquet for my best friend who has clearly lost her mind. I almost laughed. Almost. And the almost was enough to ease the pressure in my chest for half a second, which, on that particular morning, was enough. I hung up with a promise to tell her everything later, and went back to the kitchen, where Lorenzo remained in the same position, leaning against the counter, mug in hand, with the unhurried patience of someone who's never in a rush, because he sets the pace for everything around him. He looked at me when I appeared in the hallway, and I had the impression, brief, uncertain, that something flickered behind his eyes that could, with a very generous interpretation, be called amusement. The local paper described the scene at Bellini's as something between a rehearsed routine and a car accident, he said, his voice dry and flat, like someone reading a headline with no intention of commenting on it. I looked at him, and for the first time in weeks, maybe months, I felt something that wasn't dread, or fear, or the constant weight of being the leftover daughter. I felt like laughing, and I did, quietly, tiredly, with the dark circles and the crumpled dress and my bare feet on the cold kitchen floor. I laughed, because the alternative was crying, and I'd already cried enough. Lorenzo didn't laugh, but the mug rose to his lips a beat later, and I was certain he was hiding something behind that sip. The terrace door stood beside the kitchen, a glass panel that opened onto a narrow space with an iron railing and a view that, at that hour, showed Lake Union draped in low mist, the city beyond it looking like an unfinished sketch. I walked to the door and stood there with the mug between my hands and the cold air slipping through the gap, and I realized I didn't want to go back to my apartment. Not yet. Not because the penthouse was welcoming. It was striking, but cold, stripped of life. But because here, in this moment, no one expected anything of me. No one was asking me to smile, to forgive, to pretend I was whole. His footsteps behind me were muted by the wood floor, and when he stopped beside me, close enough that I felt his warmth but without touching me, his voice arrived in a different register, lower, more serious. The dry irony from the newspaper comment was gone. "You're not going to work today," he said, and it wasn't a suggestion. "I have an event to coordinate on Monday," I replied, more from habit than conviction. "And today is Friday. You have the weekend. But before that, we need to talk about what you did last night." I turned to face him, and the proximity struck me like a physical reminder that being near Lorenzo Moretti was something the body registered before the mind could process. He was taller than me without shoes, tall enough that I had to tilt my face up to reach his eyes, and at this distance I caught details the night before hadn't allowed. A thin scar running along the side of his jaw, nearly invisible, the kind a less attentive eye would mistake for a shadow, hands that held the mug with long, precise fingers, the way he breathed, controlled, measured, as though even the air that entered his lungs followed a rhythm he'd imposed. "The conversation," I said carefully, weighing each word, "is about the dinner?" Lorenzo held my gaze for a moment that seemed to contain more than its allotted time, and when he answered, I knew, with the quiet certainty that arrives when you hear something you already understood without realizing you understood it, that whatever illusion of control I still held was about to collapse. "The conversation isn't about the dinner," he said. "It's about you." The cold air from the terrace came through the open door and touched my skin like a warning, and I stood there with the coffee mug between my hands and the certainty that whatever Lorenzo said next would alter something I couldn't yet name, but that I already felt, heavy and inevitable, filling all the space between us. Chapter 5. The Pretty Cage. The conversation Lorenzo had implied that Friday morning never arrived the way I'd imagined. There was no moment where he sat down across from me and laid it all out. Why I was there, why he'd said yes to the favor, why my name carried enough weight for him to hand me a bedroom in his Queen Anne penthouse. What I got instead were rules. 3 of them, delivered that same morning over the kitchen counter with the casual precision of someone reciting a phone number. Don't leave the building without someone with you. Don't use your personal phone for anything that includes an address. And don't mention my name to anyone you wouldn't trust with your life. I set my mug on the counter hard enough that coffee sloshed over the rim. "I'm not a prisoner." "No," he said, eyes still on his phone. "Prisoners don't get a choice. You have one. You can walk out whenever you like. But if I stay, I follow the rules. If you stay alive." The sentence closed my mouth, not because of how he said it. Lorenzo never raised his voice, but because of what it weighed. He delivered "you stay alive" in the same register he might have used for "you stay comfortable," and that ordinariness was more unsettling than any explicit threat could have been. I stayed, not because those words had persuaded me, but because returning to my apartment in Fremont meant returning to my mother's calls, to the glances from neighbors who'd already seen the photo circulating through group chats, and to the airless quiet of a place that still smelled like the life I was trying to shed. I stayed, but I never stopped asking. During the first week, I brought up Bellini's 3 separate times. Why had he agreed to come? Each answer was a variation on nothing. A glance, a redirect, once he simply left the room. In the second week, I asked who exactly might have taken my line at the restaurant at face value. "People who pay attention," he said, and gave me nothing else. A routine formed around those silences. Tobias drove me to the Moretti Grand every morning, always the same route, and I returned to the penthouse by late afternoon. Lorenzo was seldom home when I walked in. He'd appear later, sometimes without his jacket, sleeves pushed past his forearms, sometimes still sealed inside the full suit carrying the scent of wherever he'd been. We ate dinner at the counter from plates Tobias procured from a source I never questioned, and our conversation was sparse. Clipped sentences, functional questions, the kind of shorthand 2 people develop when they share a space without knowing what they are to each other. So I watched. It was the only tool I had, and I'd always been skilled with it. My mother had taught me, unintentionally, that observation was the difference between being blindsided and being ready. So I observed everything. I noticed Lorenzo took calls in Italian using a voice I didn't recognize. Sharper, faster, stripped of the measured pauses he employed with me. One Tuesday, he spoke a name that made Tobias rise from the kitchen chair and leave the apartment without finishing his coffee. I noticed Tobias never removed his blazer, not even inside the penthouse, and that the shape at his waistband wasn't a phone. I noticed the refrigerator was restocked without my ever seeing anyone enter, that the towels were swapped without my hearing a single footstep, that the entire building operated on an invisible machinery designed so that no one would ever need to ask how anything got done. I cataloged all of it, not out of paranoia, out of self-preservation. If Lorenzo refused to give me answers, I'd construct my own, and I watched Lorenzo, more than I should have. There was the way his fingers stilled on the keyboard the moment I entered a room. There were the dinners where I caught his gaze drifting, not to my face, but to my hand around the fork, to the shoulder where my strap had slipped, to the line of my neck when I turned toward the view of Lake Union. And there was the way he withdrew whenever he drifted too close, a single step back, always deliberate, as though there were a boundary marked on the floor that only he could see. I began to wonder what would happen the day he stopped pulling away. The answer nearly arrived on a Sunday night. Rain hammered the windows with a persistence that made the penthouse feel like it was contracting. I stood from the counter after dinner to head to my room, and Lorenzo rose at the same moment to head to his, and the hallway connecting our 2 doors was narrow enough that we passed each other at a distance that wasn't safe. I stopped. He stopped. We stood there, facing each other, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating off his body. His hand moved slowly. His fingers grazed the outside of my arm, with a touch so light it was almost a question. My skin responded before I could, a shiver that traveled upward to the base of my skull, and I tilted my face up and saw something in his eyes that emptied the air from my lungs. Want, restrained by something more powerful. Then his phone rang. Lorenzo stepped back as though the sound had scalded him. He answered without meeting my eyes, turned, and vanished into his bedroom. The door clicked shut, and I stood alone in the hallway with cold hands and a heartbeat in all the wrong places, staring at the dark wood and trying to decide whether that touch had actually happened. I went to my room and didn't sleep. Neither did he. I heard his footsteps crossing the living room in the middle of the night, measured but restless, and the sound confirmed what the touch had already told me. Lorenzo Moretti was fighting something, and he was losing. But losing wasn't the same as surrendering, and the distance between the two, I was starting to understand, was exactly where the real danger lived. The next morning he drank his coffee on the far side of the counter, as though nothing had occurred. I let it pass, but I stored it away, because I was the daughter who'd learned to survive by paying attention, and in that house, paying attention was the only weapon I owned. Chapter 6. The Square and the Half-Truth. On a Wednesday afternoon, I left alone. It wasn't a whim. It was a choice. 3 weeks inside a penthouse with no answers, sharing space with a man who brushed his fingers against my arm in the dark and acted the next morning as though it never happened. I was drowning, not in fear, in ignorance. I couldn't bear the not knowing anymore. Not knowing why he'd agreed, why he shielded me, why he retreated, why every corner of this new life circled back to questions Lorenzo met with silence. I stepped out of the Uber at the entrance to Pike Place Market, with my hood pulled up, and the excuse that I needed air that hadn't passed through the ventilation system of a Queen Anne high-rise. The market was crowded, flower vendors spilling onto the sidewalk, the smell of fresh fish and dark-roasted coffee, tourists drifting with their cameras at a pace that grated against my restlessness. And I walked with no destination, because choosing one would have meant admitting I was running. The flowers made me think of Dell, and the missing her arrived sharp and sudden, 2 weeks without seeing her. I'd been sending clipped messages. "I'm fine. I'll explain soon. Don't worry." The text equivalent of shutting the door in my best friend's face. She deserved better, but telling her the truth meant putting into language a situation I couldn't make sense of myself. And I had no idea how to say, "I'm living with a man who may be in the Mafia and who touched my arm in the middle of the night," without Dell dialing 911 before I finished the sentence. I took the side stairs down and drifted toward Pioneer Square, where the crowds thinned and the quiet gave my own thoughts room to breathe. It was inside that quiet that I noticed the car. Dark sedan, far corner, engine idling, windows sealed. I would have dismissed it if it hadn't moved when I did. I turned right. The car adjusted. I stopped. The car stopped. I cut diagonally across the square. The sedan looped the block and reappeared on the next street over. Fear clamped around my throat and drove my pulse into my temples. I didn't know who was inside that car, but I knew, with the certainty of someone who'd spent weeks absorbing the textures of Lorenzo's world, that it wasn't random. Then the black SUV materialized on the opposite corner. The rear door swung open before the vehicle had fully stopped, and Lorenzo climbed out wearing an expression I'd never encountered. Not anger. Something colder, more lethal, something that turned his face into a mask I didn't recognize. He looked at the sedan. Tobias stepped out from behind the wheel, walked toward the dark car with the unhurried ease of a man taking a stroll, and spoke something through the window I couldn't hear. The sedan pulled away without protest, as if a single word from Tobias was sufficient. Lorenzo's hand closed around my wrist, firm, allowing no debate, and steered me to the SUV. I got in. He got in beside me. The car was moving before the door finished closing. I should have been scared. Part of me was. But the larger part, the part that had spent 3 weeks stacking unanswered questions into a wall, was furious. Furious at the sedan. Furious at Lorenzo for finding me too fast in a packed market without my ever mentioning where I'd gone. The phone he'd given me. Of course, I should have known it wasn't just a phone. The silence inside the car was unlike any that had come before. Lorenzo stared forward, jaw clenched, his fingers resting on his knees with a control so rigid they were shaking. It was the first time his body revealed something his voice refused to. "You could have died today." His voice came out low, compressed. "Give me one reason to let that happen again." The sentence was a wound wearing the costume of a reprimand, and I felt anger surge. Not at him, at myself. "Give me one reason to keep living in a house where nobody tells me anything." I fired back, and for the first time since I'd walked into that penthouse, my voice broke. 3 weeks, Lorenzo. 3 weeks of rules and nothing else. You told me we needed to talk, and then you never brought it up again. I'm not a decoration you arrange on a shelf. I'm a person who has the right to understand why her entire life has been rearranged." He didn't respond, but the muscle in his jaw flexed in a way that told me the words had landed somewhere that mattered. The rest of the drive passed without a sound. That night, I found him in the living room, standing at the glass wall, a drink in his hand, the glowing city behind him like a backdrop he hadn't asked for. When I stepped out of the hallway, he turned with the look of someone who'd been waiting. "Why did you say yes?" I asked, steady, because I'd practiced steadiness through every minute of my shower. "That night in your office, I showed up uninvited, asked for something ridiculous, and you agreed. You owed me nothing. You didn't know me. And now you've moved me into your home, assigned a bodyguard to my life, and practically dragged me out of a public square. Why?" He placed the glass on the sideboard. When his eyes met mine, the usual composure had fractured. Small cracks, but visible. "Because when you walked into that office," his voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it, "you didn't try to impress me. You didn't cry. You didn't plead. You came in terrified and asked for what you needed anyway, and I couldn't say no." The words hung between us. I could see the weight of what he was admitting. Not a favor granted, but a choice that frightened him. The answer was beautiful, and I nearly accepted it. Nearly let the beauty of those words fill the space where the full truth should have been. But I'd spent 3 weeks watching. "That explains Bellini's," I said slowly. "It doesn't explain the rest. It doesn't explain the phone, the rules, the building with no name on it, the car that tailed me today. It doesn't explain the way you reacted when I said Ethan's name." Something moved across his face. Fast, contained, but I caught it, because 3 weeks inside that penthouse had taught me to read Lorenzo Moretti's silences more accurately than most words I'd ever heard. "Ethan Prescott," I continued, "means something to you, and that something is the real reason I'm here." Lorenzo held my gaze for a stretch of time that seemed to carry more than the seconds it occupied. Then he spoke, with a frankness that appeared to cost him like settling a debt. "Yes, but today isn't the day for that conversation. When I can tell you without putting you in more danger than you're already in." It wasn't enough, but it was more than he'd ever offered, and the way he delivered it, eyes locked on mine, no attempt to soften the gravity, made me believe there was a truth he intended to give me, just not yet. I crossed the room toward him, stopped close enough to feel his warmth, far enough that the next move would be mine. "If I stay," I said, "I'm done accepting silence where answers should be." "If you stay," he replied, and his voice shifted, sinking to a depth I'd never heard. "I'll tell you everything, but you're not going to like it. I never do. I stay anyway." I lifted my face and met his eyes, and for the first time since we'd met, Lorenzo Moretti didn't step back. I kissed him, and the instant my mouth found his, I knew 2 things at once: that this changed everything, and that he had known it would, before I did. Chapter 7. With open eyes. The kiss wasn't tender. It was built from weeks of narrow hallways and aborted touches, from gazes that lingered past their limit, and a fury I couldn't tell was his or mine. His mouth met mine with a stillness that lasted half a heartbeat, the time it took for the restraint to shatter, and then his hands were on my jaw, threading through my hair, settling at my waist, and he was kissing me back with an intensity that was disciplined and ruinous in equal measure. It was the collapse of a wall we'd both spent weeks constructing out of performed indifference. The path to his bedroom dissolved beneath me. I registered only the pressure of his hands against my back, the hallway wall grazing my shoulder for an instant, the door swinging open, and the cooler air of a room he'd been occupying alone for too long, reaching us like a held breath finally released. But the coolness didn't survive. The heat radiating from Lorenzo was its own gravity, pulling me into the center of a world he'd kept sealed. "I tried not to do this," he said against my skin, his voice raw, emptied of every layer of composure I'd come to know. "I know," I whispered, and the 2 words held everything I'd left unspoken for weeks. What followed belongs to the quiet of that bedroom, and the low light that draped over us like a second skin. It belongs to the breaths that found each other, to the hands that mapped and discovered, to the surrender of 2 bodies that had finally stopped pretending. The world beyond those walls fell away. There was no yesterday, no tomorrow, only the absolute present of 2 people giving in to what they'd been refusing for too long. It was the end of a war, and the start of something I didn't yet have a word for. I felt every moment with a sharpness that caught me off guard, every touch recorded, every murmur kept, every instant where his control peeled back a little further, and my body responded as though it had always known the language his spoke. When the silence returned, Lorenzo lay on his back with his forearm across his eyes, and his breathing still uneven. It wasn't the hollow silence from before. It was the dense, exhausted calm of someone who has passed through a storm and emerged on the other side to find the sky clearing. I lay beside him with my head on the pillow, my skin still holding the memory of every place his hands had been. "Stay," he said softly, without moving his arm, and the word sounded like it cost him more than all the others combined. An admission of need Lorenzo had never permitted himself. "I'm here," I answered, finding his hand, weaving my fingers through his in the dim light of a room that no longer felt quite so cold. But I woke before he did. I slipped out wrapped in the robe I found behind the bathroom door and crossed the dark living room to the terrace. The Seattle air met me sharp and clean, and Lake Union lay still beneath the early mist, the Space Needle glowing faintly in the distance against a sky that hadn't yet chosen between night and morning. The city seemed to be breathing slowly, as though it too were trying to decide what to make of what had come before. I rested my hands on the iron railing and let myself think about everything. The event hall overlooking Elliott Bay, Bellini's, his hand around mine, the penthouse, the wordless dinners, the hallway, the touch that was interrupted, the dark sedan in Pioneer Square, the sentence that had cut deepest. Give me one reason to let that happen again, and the half-truth he'd offered in the living room, when I can tell you without putting you in more danger. The performance had become real life. I understood that, but I also understood something else, something the Scarlet who first walked into that office would never have overlooked. Lorenzo had given me a beautiful answer and postponed the truth, and I had let him. Let him because I was exhausted, because want had outrun caution, because his body against mine had made me forget, for a few hours, that there were questions stored in a place he still hadn't shown me. I wasn't naive. I knew later could quietly become never. I knew his reaction to Ethan's name was a piece that refused to fit, that the speed with which Tobias had dispatched the sedan in the square was chilling, that the sentence, "You're not going to like it," carried a weight I still couldn't gauge. I knew I was choosing to stay with a man who dealt in half-truths, and that it could ruin me, and I chose to stay anyway, not out of innocence, out of decision, because for the first time in my life, the choice belonged to me, not to my mother, not to my ex, not to my sister, and because I believed, with the same stubborn tenacity I'd inherited from Meredith Hayes, perhaps the only thing of hers worth keeping, that I would drag the whole truth out of Lorenzo Moretti before his silence cost me more than I could afford. The first light of dawn touched the surface of the lake and turned the mist to gold. I stood there with my hands on the railing and his robe around my shoulders, and I knew that the woman who had stayed was not the daughter who was left over. She was the woman who chose to stay. Lena here. That wraps up Book 1, and I've already finished Book 2. You can get access to it for a really small fee. I told a lie at a family dinner, and by chance, the most dangerous man on the West Coast walked through the door to play along. That's what I believed for 3 months. I believed he had saved me from my ex, that, in the middle of a charade, the two of us had found something real. But this morning, looking for a work contract in his office, I opened the wrong folder, and there it all was. My ex's name, photos of me taken without my knowing, and a deal. That's when I understood. He didn't walk into Bellini's by chance. He didn't protect me because he loved me. He circled me carefully, won me over patiently, kissed me knowing exactly who I was, and waited until I mistook surveillance for fate. Now I was going to have to walk back into the bedroom where I'd left my clothes next to his, look into the eyes of the man I loved, and pretend my chest hadn't already understood first. It wasn't my ex who had destroyed me. It was the man I ran to when I needed to be saved. Like I said, that was just a taste of Book 2. To watch it uncensored, just click on the first link here in the pinned comment. I'll see you on the other side in a few seconds. Remember, just click on the first link down here in the comments, and Book 2 complete, no ads, no interruptions, will already be available for you. It's very simple. Book 2 is something I'm loving making. You're loving it too, so I promise there will be more. It's where you find increasingly spicy stories, a true dark romance. And precisely because this version is getting more and more heated, the video isn't well accepted publicly on YouTube. This closed environment is where I can actually share my essence and where I feel free to do my best work for you. More news coming soon. I'll be waiting for you on the other side.